True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Dick, sex is a powerful motivator.
Oh, for sure, I know that.
So when 53-year-old Christopher Regan became involved with younger, married woman Kelly Cochran, no one was completely shocked, even though Kelly really wasn't Chris's type. In fact, she was quite rough around the edges, abrasive, and dare I say, only minimally attractive. But she was friendly, pretty easygoing, and most importantly, she was willing. She seemed to have no moral concerns about cheating on her husband, but Chris would learn the hard way that she really had no morals at all about anything. When Chris disappeared in October of 2014, his family was very concerned. The police decided that he had either taken his own life out in the vast forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, or he'd moved away to start a new life elsewhere. But one investigator, Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo, believed that Chris had been murdered. Join us at the quiet end today for Blood Pact. Chris Regan's disappearance set off an investigation into the world of Kelly and her husband Jason. What they found included a wedding night blood pact, a chain of lies, and the horrific likelihood of a cannibalistic barbecue.
Cannibalistic barbecue? Wow. I'm not sure I can have an appropriate beer for that.
Well, it's a tough one.
But one of my favorite breweries is in Michigan, and that's Founders Brewing Company in Grand Rapids. So I chose a beer from them called Backwoods Bastard.
That's appropriate, I think.
I thought so. It's a Scotch ale, which I really like that style of beer. They tend to be pretty malty and caramelly and really good. And this one's 11.2% alcohol by volume, so we're going to need to sip it.
It's a good day for sipping.
It is. So it's a nice dark brown, reddish colored beer, small tan head, beautiful aroma of alcohol, caramel, vanilla, and kind of that smoky, peaty aroma. And the taste just follows it perfectly. Whiskey, caramel, and some smoke. It's a medium-bodied beer, very nice beer to sip. Just don't chug them. You'll be cemented to your chair.
Absolutely. Well, open one up and toss it over here.
All right, here we go.
Smells good.
I told you you'd like it.
I think I will, yeah.
Well, maybe I didn't tell you you'd like it, but it is. It's a really nice beer.
Yeah, definitely.
We just got to remember to share it. Right now, it's just you and me.
Sure.
At the quiet end. So I don't mind sharing with you. I'll share all sorts of things with you. Except for coronavirus. I'm not going to share that with you.
Okay.
Fortunately, I don't have it anyway, so I don't have to worry about sharing it.
Well, that's good news. So why don't you come over here to my quiet end and start this story, which is just outrageous.
This is one of the stranger ones we've done, I got to tell you.
Which is really saying something.
Yes, it is. Let's start talking some about Kelly, who was Chris Regan's squeeze. So Kelly's mother, her name is Melanie Gaboyan, says that she had trouble with her daughter from the time she was a young teen. And after years of trying to help her, Melanie made the heart-wrenching decision to try tough love on Kelly. So when she was 18 years old, Melanie told her that she needed to leave the house, kicked her out. She hoped that a good dose of reality would turn her around to a more positive direction. She also had 3 other kids to consider, and she didn't want Kelly and her doper friends to corrupt the other kids. So Melanie seemed like a good soul, and she'd given her daughter many chances, continually overlooking some troubling facts because she wanted her daughter to succeed in life. Who doesn't want our kids to be successful, right?
Well, of course.
Now, after Kelly got thrown out, her maternal grandmother died, and her mother, Melanie, felt depressed and lonely without her mother to talk to. Her heart softened to Kelly, and she invited her to move back in. So this wasn't too long after she got booted out.
Right, yeah.
And that the conditions of her return included random drug testing, to which Kelly agreed.
She did, but, Melanie really didn't follow through with that.
She didn't, and probably Kelly knew she wouldn't.
But not long after that, Kelly's boyfriend, Jason Cochran, moved in. Jason and Kelly were planning to get married. Melanie saw a familiar pattern of drug use with Kelly, but Kelly refused to get counseling. She really wouldn't listen to anyone. As a teen, Kelly dealt with her mother's rules by running away from home, sometimes living on the streets, doing drugs, and drinking to excess. Melanie was frightened for her as she got older and nothing was seeming to change for the better. And she really did see Kelly's drug use escalating. She had moved on to snorting hallucinogenic drugs, meth, and cocaine. She also only worked sporadically. And Melanie was not impressed with Jason. So after these two married, they moved out of Melanie's house, but it wasn't wedded bliss by any means. They were very possessive of one another, so it was a very dysfunctional relationship. And on their wedding night, they supposedly made a blood pact that if either of them cheated with another person, the cheating partner would be required to kill their lover.
Excuse me?
We didn't do that, no. But yeah, that's...
No, we didn't do that. I don't think I'd sign on to that one.
No.
Anyway, but that's just weird.
Very weird. And is it true? We don't know. Because she, of course, is not an honest person and may have just thrown that in for dramatic effect.
Yeah, but that sounds pretty weird. If you cheat on me, that means you got to kill the person you cheated on me with?
Well, yeah, because you can't keep living in the same world with that person.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Okay.
They have to be eliminated.
Oh,
and that's
okay.
what she would say happened. So Kelly would describe Jason also as a violent man with a violent temper. She would describe times when he abused and tortured animals. But, she didn't show any emotion when she talked about these brutal acts of animal cruelty. And she really did describe some heartbreaking, graphic cruelty to animals in a very emotionless tone. She claimed to like animals and be upset by Jason's cruelty, but there was no sign of that when she told these stories. She would also claim to be afraid of Jason, but most people who knew and spent time with the couple saw Jason as the calm, more relaxed partner, and Kelly as the volatile one who was really running the show. To most people, Jason was more of a gentle giant. One former friend spoke about Jason's family having lots of farm animals, and that Jason seemed to be kind to these animals and happy with them. So there was nothing about his behavior then or later to indicate really that Jason would become a killer. Only what Kelly would say afterwards.
Yeah, in the texting history between Jason and Kelly, there was never one single episode to be found where Jason spoke to Kelly in a threatening manner. And Kelly herself never came across in her own texts as a woman afraid of her husband. Actually, if anything, her text showed that she was the aggressor. She was in control of the situation. And Jason's replies showed a man who is verbally bashed and controlled by a domineering wife. So we've got a real dichotomy here. We've got the appearance on the outside that Jason's this badass, but it turns out that's not the case, or probably not the case.
Sure. I mean, really, we don't get the vibe from him that he was domineering or abusive to her. And she certainly didn't seem like she would be afraid of anyone.
Yeah, it sure doesn't.
So Kelly and Jason, they owned their own pool cleaning business in Indiana, where they built and serviced and cleaned pools. But by 2011, Kelly said she took over all of the physical work because Jason had a sciatic nerve problem and some back pain. So he was supposedly disabled and could only work 1 day a week.
Yeah, now I'm always suspicious of that. I'm sorry. Without even knowing a lot of the history. I mean, back pain is such a convenient thing to use as an excuse.
Well, I can see where you might see that, but it's definitely a real thing for a lot of people.
It is.
It's just hard to prove.
It's hard to prove. And it's like he was working and doing stuff, and then suddenly he had back pain and he couldn't work anymore.
Well, I don't know how sudden it was, but yes. He could only work 1 day a week, according to Kelly. So the couple, they moved to Michigan, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, And that's when, according to Jason and Kelly both, Kelly began having sex with other men. And she made no effort to hide this from her husband. Jason actually begged her to come home after work and not spend her evenings with other men. And these texts, as you can imagine, were kind of pathetic and desperate. But you know what they weren't? They weren't threatening.
No, they weren't.
So that really went against everything that Kelly was trying to say about him.
Now let's move over to Chris, who was the paramour of Kelly, among others. Chris Regan Sr. grew up in Northville, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. That's where you grew up, right?
Not in Northville, but very close to there.
You were in that area.
Yeah, but Northville's fancy. I was in Redford Township, which was more trashy.
Okay. So, and Chris Sr. met his wife, who lived in Rochester, while they were still in high school. And not long after graduation, they got married. So Chris was married for 28 years, and he had 2 sons with his first wife. And they divorced in 2010. 3 months after the divorce, Chris remarried. Well, that's kind of a rebound, don't you think?
It's pretty quick.
That marriage didn't last very long, and he got divorced a second time. 2 times divorced. But then he reconnected with an old girlfriend named Terry O'Donnell. So Chris moved from Sutton's Bay, which is a small town on the east side of Lake Michigan, to Iron River to be near Terry.
Now, Terry had known Chris since the early 1980s when they met in a bar while Chris was still in the service. Then they lost touch for years, but they met again through Facebook. By April of 2014, Terry and Chris had broken up romantically, but they remained friends. So they still saw or spoke to each other 2 or 3 times a week. Wasn't a very big town, and often she would see Chris at her parents' store, which they owned in downtown Iron River, because Chris actually rented a small 1-bedroom apartment very near to there.
So and Chris had lost touch with his sons, his adult sons, after his divorce from their mother. That was his first marriage. But in 2014, he and his namesake, Chris Jr., became pretty close. Jr. was 26 years old and seemed to be ready for a change. He and his father had discussed moving in together over a year or so. So they decided they're going to leave Michigan. Both of them had lived for most of Chris Jr.'s life, and they're going to move south to Asheville, North Carolina. That's where they decided to move. That spring, before they moved to Asheville, Jr. had nowhere to live because he had given up his apartment in Traverse City. So Chris offered his son a place to sleep in the basement of the house he was renting. And many nights they would sit together and talk about their futures. So it sounds like they got some plans. We're going to move to Asheville and do well.
So that's when they really started to bond after a couple of years of not speaking.
Yeah, so his sons kind of held it against him for the divorce or something, or what?
I'm not sure about that. The long, cold, dark winters up north were really something that both of them wanted to leave behind, though. Chris's other son lived far away in Rochester, Michigan, outside of Detroit, so they rarely saw him, and they had no other family up north. So nothing was really keeping them from starting new lives in a warmer climate. Asheville offered the most for both of them, they believed. Both were mountain bikers, and they loved to hike and really enjoyed the outdoors. Chris Jr. had spent much of his life cycling, actually, first riding a bike at the age of 3. Chris Sr. was an expert cyclist, and he had won trophies while racing when he was in the Air Force. And he had lived all over the world. Jr. had worked in bicycle shops all of his adult life, so he knew finding a job in North Carolina would be easy. So this was an exciting thing for them.
It sounds like. He's reconnected with one of his kids. That's great. And they're going to move to Asheville together. Sounds ideal. By October 2014, Chris Sr. had a job all lined up in Asheville. He'd actually signed a contract with a company and was excited to be there and get started. He did have a scheduled drug screening test that was due on October 15th in Michigan. So Chris Sr. is all prepared for the move. His apartment in Iron River was pretty messy. He had piles of things sorted out on the counters and the furniture, ready to be packed up or given away or whatever they're going to do with them.
So at this point, Chris and his dad were speaking or texting every single day. That's all through the summer and that autumn. They spoke several times each day. If Senior was busy at work, he still answered his phone for his son, and he would tell Junior that he would call him or text him back. And he always did. He always did as he said he would. And that's until mid-October. And that's when Chris Sr. just seemed to vanish.
Yeah.
Out of the blue.
There's nothing. One day he's there, the next day he's gone.
Right. So on the evening of October 15th, Chris Jr. hadn't heard from his father all day. He texted and he called him but got no response. The next morning, October 16th, Junior grabbed his iPhone before he even got out of bed to check to see if anything had come in, and there were no texts or missed calls from his dad. So this is when, Chris Jr. would say, he felt a real sickness in his gut that something had happened to his father. Just had a really bad feeling.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like they were pretty much in contact every day.
Constantly.
And all of a sudden he's not there and he can't find him?
Yeah.
I'd be worried. The other thing is on October 27th, Terry McDonald decided she needed to go to the Iron River Police also because she hadn't heard from Chris in 2 weeks. So even though they weren't romantically involved, they were still good friends, as you said. And she expected to hear from him.
Yeah, I mean, she had been in love with him. I'm not sure how much of that she still felt. But she was used to seeing him a few times a week and hadn't seen him in 2 weeks and couldn't get a hold of him.
Yeah, so Terry, drove to the police station and talked to the chief of police, Laura Frizzo, asking for help. So Laura took Terry into an office, handed her off to Cindy Barrett, who was a sergeant just arriving for her shift.
Yeah, so as I understand it, Chief Frizzo was on her way out, leaving, and she sees Terry, who just seems really distressed. So she takes her in, makes sure she's all set there, and then when Cindy comes in for her shift, she allows Cindy to take over this missing person report on Chris Regan.
Right.
So as Terry spoke to Cindy Barrett, she was sure that the last time she had seen Chris was on October 14th. So 2 weeks earlier. Since then, Terry said she'd texted Chris, she'd driven to his apartment, and she'd knocked on his door repeatedly. And this was just completely out of character for Chris. He was a guy who was normally very good about returning calls and texts right away. So Sergeant Barrett helped Terry to file a missing persons report. And Terry said that Chris's phone was going straight to voicemail. And she was really firm on the date he disappeared, October 14th. On that morning, Terry had spoken to a friend who worked with Chris, and he had said that October 14th was the last time that Chris had shown up at work. So that's even more alarming because he was normally a very dependable employee. He wasn't just going to blow off work. He went in at 5 a.m. on most days and would work until 4 or 5. So now it had been just short of 2 weeks, and no one at the job had even seen or heard from him. So something's wrong.
Something is, that's for sure. Chris worked at a company called Oldenburg Group Incorporated, which was a large manufacturing company in the town. They made defense and mining equipment. As Terry explained Chris's situation, she told Cindy Barrett that he had been planning a move to Asheville, but he wasn't scheduled to leave until the 1st of November. She thought that he was going to pick up one of his sons along the way, but Chris Sr. and Jr. had planned to drive separately so they would each have their own car. Now, he also had a great job lined up. He was looking forward to the change and starting a new life with his son. Chris Sr. was an Air Force veteran, and North Carolina was the state he had been stationed in before. Okay, so they're not going down there blind.
No. They actually were thinking hard about what would be the best type of place. And they wanted to get away from the cold because Michigan's UP. You have to really like snow to be happy there.
I understand it gets cold and snowy up there.
It's very cold. But most upsetting, Terry said, was that Chris's car wasn't parked where he usually left it, in his apartment parking lot. Also, Chris had a drug test that was scheduled on October 15th, remember, for his new job. And he didn't show up for that.
Yeah, and the not showing up isn't because he was using, because he was gone.
Right. When Terry spoke to her friend, Chris's co-worker, he told her that he thought he'd seen Chris's car at the park and ride lot in Bates Township. So Bates Township is east of Iron River, just about a 5-mile drive. Why would Chris park his car there, though? According to Terry, Chris really loved that car, a Genesis Sport. And she drove up there herself to confirm that that was Chris's car. She'd done that late on the previous Thursday night. So she saw it was his car, and she peeked inside, and was even more alarmed when she saw some of his personal things. Then the next day, which was a Friday, she tried to reach him again. She thought maybe Chris was at home, or maybe he'd been hurt or was ill and couldn't get to his phone. So she was worried. There were 2 things inside Chris's car that Terry believed he wouldn't go anywhere without. And that was a water bottle that he used as a spittoon because he chewed tobacco. Ugh. And also a knee brace because he'd recently had a procedure on his knee.
We needed it.
Yes.
Now, Terry wanted to get into Chris's apartment to see if he was okay. And there was a spare key that was normally kept in a lockbox at her parents' store that was missing. So she's getting more concerned and anxious about where Chris is. When plans had solidified for the move to North Carolina, Chris Jr. had his car loaded with his essentials. They had a place to live all set up in Nashville. But he also hadn't heard from his father in the past 2 weeks, and he really didn't know who to call. His brother and mother, because they lived so far away, rarely spoke to Chris Sr. And he also was thinking, would an adult who hadn't called in 2 weeks qualify as a missing person if Jr. himself contacted the police? So he's confused about things, but he's really feeling that something ain't right here.
Oh, sure, and he's correct to feel that way. Chief Laura Frizzo went over the missing person report on Chris Regan with Cindy Barrett and learned about his car that was left at the park and ride. So she decided to ride over and have a look at the car. And she also called the director at Chris's job. As Laura drove toward the park and ride, she kept thinking about where Chris worked. And she remembered taking a call from the director there back in September. And this was about an employee who was afraid of her husband, so she hadn't shown up for work. The company had called to ask the Iron River police if they would take a drive by the woman's house just to conduct a wellness check. So now she's wondering, are these 2 things connected somehow? When she got to the park and ride, she took a walk around Chris's car, using her flashlight to see inside, and she immediately felt that something was wrong. She had the feeling that the car had been there for quite a while, and it probably wasn't Chris who had left it there. Over the weekend leading up to Monday evening, October 27th, when Terry O'Donnell drove to the police department to report that Chris was missing, she had tried to get access to his apartment. She actually contacted a locksmith who made her a spare key, and after work that Monday, she drove to the apartment, bringing her mother with her. So Terry explained to Sergeant Barrett how she had driven straight from Chris's apartment to the police station that night. What she saw at the apartment convinced her that something was wrong. When they first entered, Terry saw a manila folder on the floor, and the apartment was really a mess. Cabinet doors were left open, there were dirty dishes in the sink, and it wasn't like Chris. So Terry was alarmed. Chris never kept his apartment like that. In fact, he was very neat. His dishes were always done and everything had its place. So the sergeant, Cindy Barrett, asked if the boxes and the messy apartment may have just been because Chris was packing to move. But Terry didn't think so. She believed the mess she saw had nothing to do with Chris packing. She thought that the condition of Chris's apartment was a sign that something had happened to him, like he'd just been pulled out of there in the middle of things. She was certain this was not the way Chris would have left his apartment. She had helped him pack once when he moved from his house to the apartment just a few months back, and then she remembered that he had packed up one room at a time, and he'd kept everything very organized.
Now the folder that was lying on the floor of the apartment contained some medical documents. She looked inside, and Terry found information about Chris taking Percocet for a knee injury that had occurred a couple months ago in August. The doctor had written an explanation for why the drug screening that Chris was going to be taking would show up positive for Percocet. Now, it just didn't make sense to anybody that Chris would just leave these important papers lying on the floor. Terry also told Sergeant Barrett one more thing. She had heard rumors that Chris had been having sex with a married woman that he worked with.
Yeah, so Chief Laura Frizzo had a pretty bad feeling about Chris's car being left behind in particular. She thought again about that incident in late September. It involved one of Chris's fellow employees, 32-year-old Kelly Cochran, the same married woman who Chris was allegedly having sex with.
Well, that sounds like something that might be related.
Yeah. So Kelly was an electrical assembler on the manufacturing line, and she looked like a tough woman. She had several butterfly tattoos on both of her arms. She had really dark, almost black, shoulder-length hair, kind of a rugged build, and some bulky shoulders. Not someone you're going to mess with. Kelly and Chris had met at work, and they started secretly seeing each other a short time after Kelly was hired, and that was in the past May. So Chris, being with Kelly, was kind of slumming it for him. He was seen as a more upstanding person in town, and he really didn't want anyone to know that he was seeing her. So not only were they very different people, and they had a big age difference, but Kelly was also married. She and her husband, Jason Cochran, an overweight, bald, 36-year-old man, had moved to Iron River earlier that same year from Hobart, Indiana. Jason was kind of tough-looking too, the outdoorsy type, but he had a very reserved personality compared to Kelly's. But clearly there was more going on here that Chief Frizzo wanted to find out about.
Yeah, so Officer Barrett accompanied Terry back to the park-in ride, and Barrett used her Slim Jim to get the car door open. Inside was the water bottle for his spittoon and his knee brace. They were still there. And they found a handwritten note with directions to the Cochran house on a Post-it note in the front passenger seat. This is when Chief Frizzo remembered that back in September, late September, the Iron River Police Department had been called to do a wellness check on Kelly Cochran at her home. This was after Kelly had called her workplace to say that she feared for her life. September 27, 2014. Kelly called work and said that her husband had threatened to kill her and then kill himself. And then the very next day, the 28th of September, Kelly didn't show up for work. So Chief Frizzo called the deputy who had done the wellness check and asked him for Kelly's address. Maybe Kelly had tossed her husband out and Chris had moved in. Maybe they left town together. Who knows? We're trying to solve this. Was Kelly planning to move to North Carolina with Chris? As you know, affairs often bring out the worst aspects in people. So if Kelly had a jealous and potentially violent husband, there was a motive for violence against Chris. Jill, what are you burning out here? Bodies?
Well, no. I'm throwing in all of our earbuds and headphones with a little bit of lighter fluid as my protest against podcast ads in my favorite shows. I'm just getting into a story or I'm dozing off and it's interrupted with commercials. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Nice movie reference. Anyway, let's just simmer down here. You do know that our True Crime Brewery listeners have the option to subscribe to our premium show for ad-free episodes and bonus episodes, right? It costs as little as $4 per month, and these contributions help support the cost of producing TCB.
Well, of course. I love and appreciate our subscribers. You know, I worked for weeks with our IT girl to set that up, and all because I have a deeply held belief that our listeners shouldn't have to hear ads.
That's well said. Now, let me ask you this. How are we going to record this week's episode without our headphones?
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Well, you stay here. I'll go get the hose.
Okay, hurry. With the police department so small, the Iron River PD often relied on outside help, especially in a case like this that wasn't simple or straightforward. Cindy Barrett contacted the Michigan State Police, and she asked them to send a trooper to meet her at 66 Lawrence Street. That was Kelly and Jason Cochran's house. Laura Frizzo encouraged Cindy telling her it was smart to go over to the Cochran house and try and ask them a few questions. So the Cochrans lived in a rental. It was a 2-story dark brown house with a rotting, rickety, handicap wooden ramp leading up to their front door. Trees and brush hid most of the house from the road. And out back there was a fire pit, an old garage, and just some garbage strewed about. Sergeant Cindy Barrett and the Michigan State Police trooper walked up the wooden ramp. But before they got to the front door, the trooper pulled Cindy aside and told her that someone had just looked out of an upstairs window. And Cindy looked up, and sure enough, she saw there was a figure behind a curtain. It was Jason Cochran who answered the door, and he seemed pretty aloof. His body language was stiff, and he just seemed annoyed that there were 2 police officers showing up on his front porch. Jason first told them that Kelly wasn't home, but then she stepped out from behind him. Didn't make him look too good.
Nope.
And she didn't appear at all nervous. In fact, she gave the initial impression that she really wanted to help out. She easily admitted that she had been involved with Chris. And when asked when she had last seen Chris, Kelly said it was on or about October 15th. Since then, she said she had tried to reach him by phone with no success. She said she thought maybe he had already left for North Carolina. And she seemed completely void of any emotion, just speaking in a monotone about this.
So they're not getting much info from her, are they?
Well, not the correct info anyway. But we'll get more into that.
Now, Cindy told Kelly that Chris's car had been located at the park and ride, and Kelly said he loved that car. Now, the fact that she spoke in the past tense was not missed by the 2 police officers.
Sure, and sometimes that does mean something.
Well, yeah, exactly. Chief Frizzo searched through the police database, but she wasn't able to find much info about Chris Reagan. Her first priority in beginning the search for Chris was to find out who he was, what he did, where he lived, and as much as she could about his family and friends. So she watched the body cam videos that Cindy Barrett had recorded while she was going through Chris's apartment. She also studied the documentation from Chris's doctor that was found inside that file on the floor. She noted that Chris's doctor had given him a prescription for pain pills, and he had just had some knee surgery. But his knee brace was found on the front seat of the car. She read the Chris letter from his doctor, which was dated the 14th, explaining that he'd had knee surgery.
I think you can just say Chris's letter.
She read Chris's letter from his doctor, dated October 14th, which explained he'd had recent knee surgery, and any drug screening he'd have for his new job would show the pain meds he was on. So he wanted to prove why that narcotic was in his system. Now, why would he go to all that trouble of getting the stuff together if he planned on disappearing or worse, committing suicide?
Yeah, it didn't add up. Remember, Chris had no criminal record. So Laura had looked into that, and she had almost 2 decades of experience in law enforcement. So she did personally know many experts from different law enforcement fields in the area. And she was smart enough to know when to ask for help from these former colleagues and friends. All of her years in law enforcement had given her some access to resources throughout the state of Michigan, and many of these were going to help her look into the disappearance of Chris Reagan. Because once Chief Frizzo took on a case, she really was indefatigable.
Having knowledge of cell phone usage, how cell phones hold information, where cell towers are located, and how to get ping information from a particular phone is crucial in a missing person case like the one of Chris Reagan. Law enforcement can track movements of cell phones, but only if investigators know what information to look for. So Chief Frizzo asked the Michigan State Police for assistance in the case. She and Sergeant Barrett believed that foul play was likely involved in his disappearance. The medications, the messy apartment, the abandoned vehicle, the confirmed affair with co-worker Kelly Cochran, and a note with directions to the Cochran house all showed what could be a really deadly love triangle. So they needed help in order to prepare search warrants and do interviews. The more people she spoke to, the better picture of Chris's life she would have.
Yeah, so Chief Frizzo called Public Services Incorporated in North Carolina and spoke to the man who had hired Chris for his new job down there. She really needed to eliminate the possibility that Chris had decided to take off for North Carolina early. I mean, he could have done it. It was possible he would be sending for his personal belongings. So first she needed to rule that out. And of course, he had not shown up in North Carolina. His new employer was really surprised and wondering about Chris because he'd been so excited and he'd seemed really anxious to get down there. They had been talking to him every day, and then suddenly, about 2 weeks ago, they stopped hearing from him.
Well, that's in line with what everybody else's story is.
It is. So Frizzo called up the lab where Chris was scheduled to get his drug screening for the new job. According to the paperwork found inside that folder on the floor of his apartment, Chris would have gotten the test done already, but he hadn't shown up for that, and he hadn't rescheduled it either. Her next call that morning was to Chris Jr., Chris's son, and he told her about his close relationship with his dad, which they'd really just built after a few years of not speaking. "We're planning to move down to North Carolina together," Chris Jr. told her. He's excited to move and start his new job. So Frizzo asked him when he had last spoken to his dad, and Chris had to check his cell phone, and he saw that it was October 13th at 11 a.m. And after that, Frizzo discussed with Chris Jr. if his father could have been suicidal or if he was depressed, and Chris said he'd never known his dad to be either.
So Michigan State Police Detective Chris Brackett was the first from the state police to become involved in the Chris Regan disappearance investigation. Brackett and 2 other Michigan State Police detectives joined Chief Frizzo on October 28th for a meeting about where to take the investigation next. Chief Frizzo called Iron County prosecuting attorney Melissa Powell to get some legal advice on search warrants and interview protocols. The first interviews were with Kelly and Jason Cochran, and that was in order to get them commit to a timeline. A search warrant for Chris's vehicle or apartment wasn't necessary because he was a missing person. So under the Community Caretaker Act, suspicion was enough to go into his car and apartment. So they filed for warrants to search the Cochrans' cars, house, and phone records.
Well, October 14th was known to be the last day Chris had contacted anyone. That was really easy to figure out. After he had made some purchases on his credit cards that day, there was no more banking activity on any of his accounts. Frizzo also got a hold of some CCTV footage from a local gas station from October 14th between 3:30 and 5 p.m. Chris's car is seen pulling in, and a man who looks like Chris is seen pumping gas. Then he drives away. So this gas station was located between the park and ride and the Cochran house. So there's no way that Chris himself would have left his car in the park and ride lot unless he met someone there and got into their car. But even if that's true, why would he leave the car there for days, and where the hell was he?
Yeah, I mean, that just doesn't follow.
No. Well, and just the fact that he didn't show up for work or return his son's calls, something's happened to this man.
Something has, yeah. I mean, you've got a bunch of sources that haven't heard from him for 2 weeks.
Yeah,
and
pretty much
just
right down to the day
Yeah.
they know when they last saw him or spoke to him.
Exactly. So Chris Brackett and another Michigan State Police detective drove to the Cochran house and asked Kelly if she'd be willing to come down to the Iron River Police Department to be interviewed. Kelly seemed pretty calm and unconcerned, and she readily agreed to come on down.
So there were 2 other detectives who did the interview, and they did allow Chief Laura Frizzo to observe. She had wanted to be involved, and as she watched the interview, she was quite upset that the detectives weren't asking any follow-up questions or putting any pressure on Kelly. Kelly explained that she was upset with Chris at the time she last saw him because he'd been texting her and calling her every day, and then he had suddenly stopped. She said they wanted to keep the relationship casual because Chris was moving anyway. So Kelly said that Chris had asked her to move to North Carolina with him, but that she had told him Michigan was her home and she wasn't leaving. Many people would disagree with this and say that he never would have asked her to move with him.
Well, no. Number one, she's married.
Well, if she left her husband. But he didn't want her to leave her husband.
Right.
So Brackett asked what they did that last night that they were together, and Kelly said that she brought a lasagna to Chris's apartment, they ate, and she went home because he goes to bed early, like around 7:30. Kelly said the conversation was mostly about Asheville. He was really excited to be moving south with his son, and also really excited about his new job there. When asked what she thought had happened to Chris, Kelly said she really had no idea. She said she'd been texting and calling him for 2 weeks with no response. And Brackett asked if Chris had ever been over to Kelly's house, and she said, well, yes, he has. She said he'd been to the house weeks before he disappeared. So Laura Frizzo is watching this, and she's wondering why directions to the Cochran house were found on Chris's car seat if he'd been there before. But the detectives didn't ask that. I mean, I guess the note could have been left over from a few weeks back.
Well, okay. Doubt it.
It's doubtful. But Kelly said that Jason wasn't at home when Chris visited the house.
Well.
So after a while, the focus of the interview became Jason and Kelly's marriage. And Kelly admitted that Jason had often taken off by himself fishing and hunting, and she really had no idea what he was doing or where he was or who he was with. But she also said she'd never considered that he might have done something to Chris.
Yeah, so the detectives believed that Kelly was hiding things from them. She wasn't being entirely truthful. Jason, for his part, was sitting outside the interview room, and he looked pretty nervous, sweaty, restless, just agitated. As they were coming to the end of the interview, Kelly told the police that living in Upper Michigan felt like being part of a community, and she liked how she could go to sleep with the doors unlocked.
So that's random.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, the next to be interviewed was Jason. I'll tell you guys in advance, he said right away. I see a therapist for high anxiety. I've been institutionalized a little over a month ago. So the detective told him that if the interview got too uncomfortable, he should ask for a break. And they were trying to seem like they're just sitting there shooting the shit with Jason, and that he and Kelly weren't suspects.
Well, Jason seemed like someone who was hiding something, though. He said he knew that his wife had been seeing other men, but that he didn't want to know any of the details. He said he did know of Chris Reagan, but only by name. He'd never met him. According to Jason, he had told Kelly a while back that he wanted her to stop seeing other men, and then he mentioned several health issues that he had that were to blame. He'd lost a kidney, he said. He had severe back pain and nerve damage, and he couldn't move around much. So he said he couldn't perform sexually. When asked if he believed Chris was the only one his wife had been sleeping with on the side, Jason said he knew of at least one other man. So then he was really talking down about himself, calling himself an unfit husband who was always depressed, and he also denied ever threatening Kelly or Chris.
Yeah, now Kelly claimed that on October 14th, which is the last time she saw Chris, she brought lasagna to his apartment for dinner.
Right.
Now, in the photos Sergeant Barrett had taken inside the apartment, there is a large box in front of Chris's stove, and on top of the stove were piles of household items. Nowhere were there dirty pans or dishes in the sink, and there weren't any clean dishes in the washer. In fact, there was no sign that Chris had even eaten a meal in the apartment in the days before his disappearance. Everyone said that Chris almost always ate fast food.
Yeah, he just didn't cook.
No, if we can microwave, who needs to cook?
And it didn't look like lasagna had been cooked there either. But, Kelly would come up with different reasons for this whole lasagna story. Jason was asked when he had learned about Kelly's relationship with Chris, and he said that he had discovered a text message on Kelly's phone back in July. One thing Kelly had mentioned to detectives during her interview is that she thought maybe Jason had put a GPS tracker on her truck to try and catch her cheating, but we have no evidence of that. Laura Frizzo is watching this and finding Jason to be very suspicious. But when the Michigan State Police detectives finished and came back to talk to her, they said they didn't think Jason had it in him to kill anybody. In fact, they didn't think that he or Kelly were involved in Chris's disappearance at all. And this just drove her crazy because she felt certain that they had something to do with it.
Yeah, she's got this sense that they're involved.
Sure, they're acting strangely, and something's happened to this guy.
Well, and let's look at this. I mean, she's a resident of the same town. She has her finger on the pulse of what's going on. And these two state police detectives really don't. They kind of led her down the wrong path, saying that this couple isn't involved.
Yeah, but she saw the interviews and was able to form her own opinion.
Yeah, well, she's a local. She's more able to do that.
True. So the second man who Kelly had apparently been sleeping with on the side was a co-worker of Chris's. And one of the places that he and Kelly met up was Wildwood Lake, that was just east of Iron River in Bates Township. So they met up more than once at the park and ride, he said, and that's where Chris's car had been found, remember. They would go to a couple of different places, including their spot near the lake, he said, to have sex. They'd talk, they'd find a secluded area. Then they would go back to their own separate lives when they were done. He gave the detectives his cell phone, which still had some text threads between he and Kelly. And you know what was interesting is that Kelly broke off all contact with this guy on October 14th, the very day that Chris disappeared. Detectives interviewed Jason on October 31st again, and he said that he knew Chris by name only. Regarding the affairs that Kelly was involved in, Jason said he just didn't want to know about them, so he didn't ask any questions. Lately, though, he said, things with Kelly had been better, since Chris was out of the picture. Nah.
Uh-huh. Now, Jason said that he wanted to help the police, so they talked about fishing. Jason liked to fish for trout at a body of water which was called the Caspian Pit, and that was a few hundred feet from his house. From there, Jason could see what was going on back at the house. So he could be out there fishing and he could be keeping an eye on his house.
Yeah, I guess so.
He said with all his health problems, it was a good place for him to sit and think.
Yeah, but still, he had to be able to get himself out there and stuff. So he couldn't have been terribly disabled.
Well, you already called me out on that, so I'm going to leave that part now.
Well, no, I just didn't want to make any general comments about that because a lot of people do have legitimate back problems that disable them.
Yeah, no, I was just giving a preview, I guess.
Right, because Jason did do a lot of things he probably shouldn't have been able to do if he was actually disabled by his back, yeah.
Right.
So focusing back on October 14th, detectives asked about what Jason had done that day. He said, well, I guess I'd gone fishing or for a walk, or maybe went across the street to visit a neighbor. The detective told Jason that he could understand that Jason might be relieved if Chris Regan was out of the picture. And Jason agreed, yeah, he was relieved. But then he added that he hoped Chris would show up so this investigation could come to an end.
Well,
Said it was kind of stressful for he and Kelly.
I imagine it was. They're probably the prime suspects, right?
Yeah, I think they're starting to get that.
Now, after they refused to take polygraph tests, the Cochrans ended up moving back to Indiana. Now, they left everything behind when they fled, according to the police. The furniture was still in the house, along with some personal items and groceries. So taking off right after a search warrant for their home was approved convinced detectives that they were somehow involved in Chris's disappearance. Well, yeah.
Sure.
And not only that they fled, but the way they fled. They basically just took off.
Right, yeah. That never looks real good.
No, it doesn't.
So police went in to search the Cochrans' house, and of course they also canvassed the neighbors. Laura Frizzo talked to a neighbor of the Cochrans named David Saylor, and also his uncle. They had been hanging out with Jason a few weeks back, smoking weed together, and they reported that they had heard sawing and some power tools in the middle of the night. And when they asked Jason about it, he told them that he couldn't sleep, so he was doing some work on a staircase in the house. The neighbor found this explanation really odd because he'd never seen any construction materials going in or out of the house, and he knew that Kelly and Jason were basically broke all the time. Also, that upstairs of that house had already been renovated. Then the neighbor shared a story about this out-of-the-blue dinner invitation that he had received from the Cochrans.
Yeah, first, they heard the power tools in the middle of the night in mid-October. Then they had these barbecues. The first barbecue was October 16th, which was 2 days after Chris went missing. And then there were a couple more barbecues. And according to David, Cochrans had huge amounts of meat they were barbecuing and sharing with them. No side dishes, just the meat. And the meat It was this strange texture and strange taste that David had never eaten before. Now, Jason had told David that he used to be a butcher and specialized in exotic meats. So David went to wash his hands after eating at their house. He couldn't find a towel. And then when talking to Laura Frizzo about this, David seemed to just realize the horrible possibility that he and his uncle had actually been fed Chris Regan's body. I'm getting something rising in my stomach at this point.
It's really gross, yeah.
Now, according to the recorded interview with the police chief, David turned to his uncle and said, "Dude, we ate dude." Oh, jeez.
It's just ghastly.
David's been traumatized by this one, obviously.
Yeah, he said he was really traumatized, that he's lost weight and has trouble eating, and I can imagine.
Oh, no shit. Oh, God.
So David had really seen Jason as a good friend, and now he said he really has trouble trusting anybody after that.
Well, certainly Jason. I mean, here they are just hanging out together, smoking a little weed and having a good time, and then they eat somebody's flesh?
Apparently.
Apparently.
When Jason and Kelly's house was thoroughly searched, police found dozens of weapons, and they also found some painted over blood on a ceiling. It took 2 weeks, but then they had forensic testing results proving that it was blood, but unfortunately they couldn't prove that it was Chris's blood or even human blood. Police were still convinced that Chris had been killed at the Cochran house, though. That's what the phone records were showing. So they searched again, and this time they found sections of wall and some doors that appeared to have blood on them. These samples were sent out for DNA testing. In the basement of the house, Laura Frizzo found notebooks with story outlines in them that had been written by Jason Cochran. One of the titles was Where Monsters Hide, and this was some scary, twisted stuff. In one chapter, he wrote about an uninvited guest and some dark thoughts that he was having about killing the visitor.
Elimination samples to compare to the found blood were obtained by getting DNA from Chris's son, Jr., Kelly Cochran and Jason Cochran. On March 5, 2015, after private investigators were able to locate Jason and Kelly, they planted a GPS tracker on the Cochrans' pickup truck.
Yeah, remember, they're in Indiana now.
Right. And the police in Indiana agreed to help obtain DNA samples from Kelly and Jason.
Yeah, for some reason the GPS tracker stopped working, but David, the old neighbor, agreed to help the police by recording his telephone conversations with Kelly and Jason. They told David during one conversation that they were at Kelly's mother's house in Indiana, so detectives served warrants for DNA samples on the Cochrans there. Jason was taken into an interrogation room, and Chief Frizzo showed up to talk with him. While he was in the room, Kelly was trying repeatedly to reach him on his cell phone, so she's probably freaking out, panicking here a bit.
Yeah, things are getting tight on him.
Yeah.
So Frizzo tried to get Jason to talk and turn on Kelly, but he wouldn't do it. Frizzo was convinced that Kelly was the mastermind and that Jason, if he was involved at all, was just doing what she told him to do.
Yeah, it really seemed that way. But neither Jason nor Kelly would confess to killing Chris. Kelly had claimed that she didn't know where the park and ride even was, where Chris's car had been found, but then she was confronted with information about the other ex-lover, saying that they had met up there on many occasions. And that's when Kelly decided she needed a lawyer.
Good choice.
But they did get her DNA sample, and of course Frizzo's just convinced now that Kelly was the planner and the leader in this murder. Because she's convinced that Chris is dead at this point. It's been months.
And the more they talk to the couple, they're saying that Jason is just not the type of person that's going to do this stuff.
At least not on his own, right?
Right. Kelly, yeah.
Well, there was also a neighbor across the street from the Cochrans' Michigan home who remembered that there was a big fire in the Cochrans' burn pit in October, and that it had smelled really bad. And that spring, a search of the Caspian pit was done to look for evidence of a murder or disposal of a body. So remember, the Caspian pit is somewhere where Jason used to fish. It was only about 600 yards from the house. But this was also a place where criminals liked to dump weapons and evidence. So divers went in and they found a cement block with some rope attached to it. And they also found the burn barrel that was missing from the Cochrans' backyard.
Uh-huh.
So now they're getting somewhere. According to the neighbor, the smell of that fire that night just wasn't right. And he said he'd actually said something to Kelly about it, but she tried to brush him off. So the burn barrel found at the pit was empty, but the fire pit was still full of ash, because remember, it was covered with snow, and now the snow is melted, it's spring, and they can access that better. So police sifted through the ash, and they found a zipper and buttons and grommets from a pair of Old Navy jeans. And Chris was known to wear Old Navy jeans. They also found an old saw blade in there. So, some circumstantial evidence, if nothing else.
Yeah, then in April 2015, Chief Frizzo got the disappointing news when the lab called that the blood samples from the house could not be identified due to chemical and paint contaminating it. Step back for police.
Yeah, so that's when the FBI was brought in to help. And they believed that the Cochrans had likely committed murder and covered it up at least once before this. The FBI reverse engineered the GPS of Chris Regan's car and were able to determine that he had been at the Cochran house on October 14th, 2014, the very night he had disappeared. Underneath the Cochran's house, the FBI also found a rabbit's foot. Chief Frizzo contacted Chris's ex-girlfriend Terry O'Donnell and asked her if she knew of Chris ever owning a rabbit's foot. And Terry did remember that Chris did own a rabbit's foot, which he kept with him for good luck. So here's more evidence that the Cochran's house was the last place where Chris had ever been alive.
Then in February 2016, 16 months since Chris's disappearance, a 911 call came to the sheriff's department in Lake County, Indiana. And on the phone was Kelly Cochran. She said that her husband was all sweaty and not breathing and she needed an ambulance. Ambulance was dispatched. When it arrived, Jason was dead. So EMTs would later report that Kelly acted strangely at the scene. She was getting in the way of them trying to do things and trying to distract them. They actually had to ask her to leave the room so they could work on Jason.
Yeah, so I guess at first, Jason's death just appeared to be from a drug overdose. A local homicide detective was assigned to this case to rule out murder, and the detective assigned to the case was a man named Jeremy Ogden. He called up Chief Frizzo to get all the documents on the missing person case of Chris Regan. He interviewed Kelly, and he found her to be very controlled. So because of her history and all that's going on, homicide was of course suspected in Jason's death.
Well, yeah, that's where it's leading.
So Detective Ogden attended the autopsy to make sure that the medical examiner knew the background and what was going on here.
Right.
Jason did have a significant amount of heroin in his system, but there were signs of strangulation. So his death was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. And police believed that Kelly was worried Jason would talk about Chris's murder, so she killed him to protect herself. So that all adds up.
Yes, it does. So Detective Ogden worked over the next few months to get Kelly to trust him and confide in him. But she wasn't talking. A few days after Jason's death, the FBI was contacted by a man named Walt Ammerman, who said he was Jason's best friend and online gaming buddy. He was concerned that Kelly was behind Jason's death. He knew that a former co-worker of Kelly's was missing. That's Chris. He agreed to become a confidential informant for Detective Ogden.
So this was really great. The plan was for Walt to call Kelly and tell her he had received a letter from Jason, which had been written before he died, of course. And Walt himself actually wrote the letter because he knew how Jason would talk and how he put his words together. He said he even signed it quack quack, which was something Jason was known for saying. So Walt met with Detective Ogden, and they recorded as he made a call to Kelly. This was March 12th, 2016. So of course Walt was super nervous, who wouldn't be? But he did a really good acting job, and to me, he sounded really convincing. Walt told Kelly about getting a letter from Jason, and that it had another letter inside, and instructions to send that letter to the Iron River Police Department. So this just freaked her out, as you can imagine.
I'll bet it did.
And her response was quite telling because she said, "Please don't mail it." And then 2 days later, she texted Detective Ogden, and she met with him at the police station and told him that, yes, Jason had murdered Chris Regan, and she was going to tell him all about it.
Yep, she's got to come clean.
Well, kind of. She's saying that Jason did it.
Well, yeah, come clean on him.
Okay.
This is going to get her off the hook, right?
That's what she's trying for, but they're not buying that. Kelly claimed that Jason had shot Chris in the back of his head in the entryway of their house. Then they dismembered Chris's body and got rid of it. So this was a horrible crime. Even though Chris's family and friends had believed he was no longer alive, the news of the horrible death he had and what they did to his body was just devastating. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Oh, I know.
Horrible.
So Kelly agreed to show detectives where Chris's remains were. They drove from Indiana to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a good 6 hours drive. When they got to Iron River, Kelly led police to a nearby county road. They drove down the road into the woods to the spot where his remains had been dumped. This area was this vast forest, so you could put some dead bodies in there and you'd never find them.
Yeah. Beautiful, but just vast.
So Kelly went back to the house and walked Detective Ogden through the scene of the crime. This was videotaped. There were knives all over the house. She reenacted the murder with Detective Ogden. She said that she and Chris were having sex in the entryway and gradually making their way upstairs. This is one of those bad porno movies, right?
Well, the thing about this is, I think she got a kick out of that because she'd get a smile when she'd say, oh yeah, we were having sex.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she was just getting some kind of thrill about saying these things. She's not likable, just to let you know.
Thanks, I missed that. So, they're going at it, heading upstairs, and then Jason shows up and shot Chris from behind. Kelly said she didn't even know that Jason was home. She invited Chris over for sex with her, which he did, and he got shot. Kelly's version of events was only remotely possible. It's more likely that Kelly knew Jason was there the whole time.
Well, yeah. Even the physical setup of what she said happened seemed really unlikely.
Well, yeah.
But after they returned to Indiana, police were still searching for Chris's remains. But Kelly was still not in custody. She was supposed to show up and talk to Detective Ogden again, but then that day she didn't show up. She fled.
Another rabbit.
So Chief Laura Frizzo went to the prosecutor and asked for a warrant. Once they got an arrest warrant, Ogden had Kelly's phone tracked, and they were able to locate her. She'd gone to Wingo, Kentucky. The state police took her into custody and charged her with homicide and accessory after the fact to a felony.
Yeah, so once she was in custody, she was transferred back to the jail in Iron County. Kelly confessed that she was supposed to kill Chris and that the homicide had been planned. She mentioned the Blood Pact that she and Jason had made on their wedding night. So according to the pact, if you've forgotten this, she'd had an affair with Chris, so she was responsible to kill him. But she said she had feelings for Chris, and in the end, Jason agreed to do the murder, the killing. So she asked Chris to come to their house. She met him at the back door, and Jason shot him in the head. The whole thing was planned. She led Chris to his death.
Right. So again, she agreed to take the police to his remains. So they went to this other area, and she said the remains were left in black trash bags. But she didn't seem at all bothered by what she'd done to Chris, which is just really freaks me out. They brought dogs in for a search of the wooded area, and during this search, Kelly smiled and giggled. And then she admitted that the blood gave her pleasure to taste, with the gunshot done so close up to her.
Ew.
Yeah, so she smiled and hung out there smoking a cigarette, just all casual. So she's a scary person.
Very.
A dog finally did alert to human remains, and pieces of a black bag were found. And then there was a clearing where Chris's skull was eventually found. Then, when Chief Laura Frizzo went back a few weeks later to do a reenactment with a documentary crew, they found Chris's lower jawbone with his teeth. So nothing had been buried and there'd been a lot of animal activity, so this was just out in the open and was so shocking for everyone. I just can't imagine.
I'll bet.
Ugh.
You're nosing around, you find a jawbone with teeth.
Oh, it's just terrible.
Ah. Then about a year later, Kelly accompanied detectives to the Caspian pit and identified the site where the burn pit was dumped back in 2014. Even though multiple searches had been done in the Cochran house, Kelly was able to point out a pair of forceps, and she claimed that Jason had made her use these forceps to try and remove the bullet from Chris's head. And what do you know? The forceps did test positive for Chris's blood.
Now, those were the only things that you could conclusively say was Chris's blood. So how they were left behind and not tested earlier, this was a year later.
I know. What's with that?
It just seems like not the best investigation overall.
Yeah, so Kelly pled not guilty to murder, and she remained in jail because there was a $500,000 cash bond. She claimed that she was afraid of her husband and couldn't go to the police.
Yeah, so that was her excuse, is that she was afraid of Jason, so she couldn't say anything about Chris being murdered. But then in May of 2017, she was convicted in Michigan, and she was sentenced to life in prison for Chris's murder. Kelly's brother then came forward to tell police that his sister might be a serial killer. He had stories straight from Kelly saying that she had killed 9 men, and Kelly also spoke to her mother from prison. Of course, that call was recorded, and Kelly said she was always a sociopath and never felt any empathy for anybody. She went ahead and pleaded guilty to the murder of her husband, Jason, and she also said that all of her butterfly tattoos were symbols for her victims. So we don't know if this was some kind of creepy bragging that she's doing about killing 9 people or more. But the professionals do believe that she probably had killed before. But no other bodies have been brought up, so we don't know. I mean, she's the type of person that would brag about that, right?
Yeah.
And be proud of it.
I would say that. So she was charged with murdering Chris and convicted for that.
Yeah.
And then decided she might as well confess to killing her husband?
Yeah, because once she's got life in prison, she's just saying
she
it
hadn't
all.
been charged for that.
For what?
For killing the husband.
Well, she would have been taken to court on it, but she decided to plead guilty on that charge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so she
was charged.
She was heading in that direction.
Oh, of course. They weren't going to let it go. They knew that he had been strangled. And they certainly had a motive now that she was guilty of murdering Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I have one other question.
Sure.
If they killed Chris and dismembered him and disposed of his remains, what meat was being served at the barbecues? Did they save some of Chris?
Yeah, I think that they saved a lot of the meat and ate it and served it. Maybe they got some kind of thrill out of that. I don't know.
Ew.
But then they took the bones and other things out. But she said that they had dismembered him into little pieces.
Yeah. I was hoping that the cannibalism was just more of a bragging type of thing, but apparently not.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, according to what the neighbors said, it really sounds like it. Having some weird textured meat. And they were usually broke, so where would they have bought a bunch of exotic meat? I don't even know what exotic meat means, and I don't want to know. But where would they have bought a bunch of meat anyway?
Well, I'm exotic meat.
Okay.
Well, yeah, no, I don't know where they would have gotten exotic meat.
It's just gross.
And I didn't know there was a specialty of exotic meat preparer.
Well, we do know that he never did that, so that makes me think that they probably did have some cannibalism going on. I know, it's disgusting. So our sources for this case: the State of Michigan Judicial Court documents, Where Monsters Hide, the book by M. William Phelps, ID Channel Special, it's a 2-parter, which I thought was really good. It's titled Dead North. And we also found some court TV trial footage, which is just a hoot. And this woman is unbelievable.
She certainly is.
So thank you to Tristan Capel for our music. If you enjoy our shows, would you please consider leaving us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen? It really helps us a lot in finding new listeners. If you visit our website, tiegrabber.com, you'll also find a shopping page where you can buy some brewery merch. And now that it's autumn, we have warm, soft hoodies, we have zip-ups and pullovers. We also have our masks, which I'm surprised a lot of people have actually bought those. So that's pretty cool, because that's really saying our name out loud to have that right across your mouth like that.
No kidding.
It's good PR for us, actually, isn't it?
We should pay these people that bought them.
Yeah, we really should. And don't forget, you can subscribe to our members-only show, True Crime Brewery Premium, on our website. And as a member, you get a new bonus episode each month. You get ad-free versions of the weekly show. And of course, you get a gift with a handwritten thank you note from us. And once you're a member, you won't have to listen to any of this self-promotion ever again.
Not ever. Okay, I got some feedback for you, Jill. I have a couple voicemails and an email. So you want to do some voicemails?
Sure.
First up is Rick, who's got a comment on the Doctor's Wife episode.
Hi, Dick and Jill. I was just listening to the episode on the Doctor's Wife, and you had mentioned towards the end that perhaps the prospective partners should have maybe talked to Dante's peers, people that know her or whatever, and see if they thought she was like batshit crazy or something. From a life experience, I can tell you that this doesn't always work, because I did that very thing with one of my life partners. They didn't tell me that she was a bipolar paranoid schizophrenic, and she didn't tell me that she was supposed to be on medication, and she didn't tell me that she had stopped taking said medications. So about a year, a little bit more than a year into the relationship, she started going kind of berserk, and she put herself into a hospital a couple of times, but it was never caught or mentioned that she actually had these diagnoses previously. So when she freaked out and did over $10,000 worth of damage to my home, she damaged one of my cars and nearly killed me, that's when her mother says, "Oh, well, maybe I should have told you that she had these problems when she was younger." I'm like, "You think?" I mean, didn't it occur to you or anyone to, I don't know, let me know about this kind of stuff? I mean, yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, and I hope you two are faring out well during all this crap, and everything's starting to come back to normal for you. Keep up the good work, and I'll keep up listening. Thank you very much.
That's a great one. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, we're sorry that nobody was open enough to you to divulge your partner's difficulties.
Well, sure, but let's think about this. Is it really fair to do that either? This is private health information, really. So should her friends and family really be telling every new person that she starts a relationship with, beware, she's a schizophrenic or whatever?
Well,
that's something she should share with her partner, obviously.
Well, certainly. But I'm looking at it also from a standpoint of this guy, Rick, is asking a friend of his, or a mutual friend, because he's considering a serious relationship with the woman. What do you know? And they don't tell him.
Well, I mean, like you said, it doesn't always work. And, you can also have people who will be against the person and might say negative things on purpose.
Well, sure. But then you sort the comments out and decide what you believe and what you don't believe.
Sure. But, mental illness is so tricky and we handle it so poorly anyway.
Yeah.
That's part of the issue. I think as far as the criminal behavior, though, you should definitely do a background check on anybody that you're going to move in with or anything like that, unless you've known them since childhood. It doesn't cost very much, and it might save your life.
Yeah, we've talked about that in the past.
I'm totally for background checks.
I think it's a great idea.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. That was kind of hilarious, I hate to say. Feel bad for you, but we did have a laugh.
He told it in a good way.
Yeah.
Now we have another voicemail from our friend Bex, and she's going to comment on the Palmyra episode, and she's also got a case suggestion for us.
Hey, Dick and Jill, this is Bex calling, and I want to say that Palmyra Island episode was one of the craziest and most fascinating things I have ever heard. So if people haven't listened to that one, definitely go back and check it out. It is wild. So I actually also have a case suggestion. I had just heard about a situation in Canada with a doctor. His name is Dr. John Schneeberger, and he definitely does not live up to the image of the good doctor. So I'll leave it at that, but it's just kind of fascinating and, awful what happened, but it might make a great episode, and I'd love to hear both of your takes on it. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Well, thanks, Bex. I thought Palmyra was fascinating as well. I believe someone recommended that to us. I can't remember off the top of my head.
I forget who.
But yeah, just a hell of a story.
It was recommended. Mm-hmm. And it is. It's a fascinating story. And this is like a 40-year-old story.
Yeah. Yep.
It was a fascinating story.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Bex's suggestion, there's no murder involved, but it is fascinating. Schneeberger is a Canadian physician who was accused of rape by a patient when she was under sedation.
Ugh.
Now, they did DNA testing because there was fluid, and that was negative on 2 different occasions. Then his wife accused him of sedating and raping her daughter from a previous marriage. And this time DNA testing was performed not only with blood, but also a swab of the cheek and hair follicles. And this time it matched the DNA recovered from the first victim.
So they made an error the first times?
No, this is pretty interesting. So at his trial, he explained how he beat the DNA testing.
Really?
Yeah, he implanted a Penrose drain. For those non-medical people, these are drains that are put into surgical sites to drain fluid.
Yeah, they're those ones that you just kind of squeeze the bulb and the suction drains it out. Yeah.
So he implanted a Penrose drain filled with anticoagulated blood from a friend of his in his forearm, and he managed to trick the lab tech into drawing blood from that drain.
No.
Now, I cannot believe
that's impossible.
that you could do that.
You have to know you're going into a vein.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking, when you stick a needle in, when you hit a vein or a blood vessel.
Of course.
So either the lab tech was totally clueless.
That doesn't make sense to me.
But no, it doesn't.
Well, maybe he got the lab tech to let him draw it himself because he was a doctor.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of different things.
Or switch the vial or something. That I could believe.
I read this and I said, there's no way on earth you can get away with that.
I can't imagine how. I mean,
twice.
I've drawn blood plenty of times, and I would know if it wasn't coming from the arm itself. Unless he had the Penrose drain stitched under his skin, which he couldn't have.
Well, yeah.
He couldn't have.
That's his story.
Right. I don't know. That's crazy. So
it is.
I'm going to read more about that because that is crazy stuff.
Okay. So that's the main thing I wanted to get into.
Okay.
In this.
That's crazy.
It just didn't sound like it would work. But
well, any of our medical people, I know we have several doctors and nurses out there. If you can think of how this could be done, I would love to hear about it. Because I just can't see how it's possible.
Well, I can see him doing it, but I don't see how the person drawing the blood would think that it was a blood vessel.
Right, exactly. It seems impossible.
Anyway, it didn't work.
No. Okay, so an email case suggestion from Lauren. Hi guys, I'm your biggest fan. As far as you guys are concerned, I'm the one that discovered you since day one.
See, thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. I've been pushing you guys on people as much as I can. For a long time, I refused to look you up to see what you guys look like so I could match your voices with a visual. When I finally looked, me and my husband had the biggest crush. They liked you, Dickie.
That's what I was taking from that they were looking at me and saying, oh.
What a man.
What a man. Both Lauren and her husband.
Yeah, well, sure, of course. I sometimes make fun of his communication skills by saying, listen, if you can't explain in words all of the ingredients of a beer after sipping it, then shut the hell up. Now he tells me that I have a nice mouth feel after kissing me. I love that. That's sweet. So thanks, Dick. You are a household name, at least in that house.
I'm a legend in my own mind.
That's great. So Lauren has a suggestion, and it's about Madeleine McCann, which we've already covered, but stuff has happened since then, I guess. So what were you able to find out about? There was an arrest.
Well, Lauren says that they finally have Christian Bruckner in custody with overwhelming evidence. So I'm just looking up. I'm not sure we have overwhelming evidence. This guy is in prison in Germany for drug trafficking. But the German prosecutors are not at all certain that they have enough evidence to charge him with Madeleine's disappearance and murder. And in fact, he had lived in the area where she disappeared from. He had been questioned by Portuguese investigators after Madeleine's disappearance and apparently cleared by them. So it's a big mystery, unless there's some newer info that I'm not aware of.
So that's all you could find. So if anybody else knows more.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
We'd love to hear that. And that would be something that we would really like to see solved.
Oh, absolutely.
I've had suspicions against the family, I've got to be honest. Especially after the dogs alerted to a trunk or... I don't know. I haven't talked about this case in a while, so I shouldn't really say anything. My memory's not that great about the details. But I do remember that I do have some suspicions against the family. But if there's actually a suspect here, it would be great to be able to solve this.
It would be.
Because that's such a tragic case. It's heartbreaking.
Absolutely. So that's it for feedback.
So thanks, Lauren. That was a great suggestion. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for writing in. And for the voicemails. We love the voicemails. They're so entertaining.
Yeah, I liked them today.
Yeah, don't be shy. Send in those voicemails because, come on, how much of our voices can you take? Let's get some fresh voices in here. I really enjoy that.
See?
Very good ones.
Good notes.
Yeah.
And actually, even in the email, I like that mouthfeel part.
Yeah, Lauren is super cute. I like that.
So thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, and we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
Got a seat saved for you. Bye.
Bye-bye.